Hi, welcome to this edition of Online with Terry Jeffrey. Our guest today is the president of the Heritage Foundation, former U.S. Senator Jim DeMint. Senator DeMint is a graduate of the University of Tennessee. He earned an MBA from Clemson. He was the president of DeMint Marketing Group. He was elected to 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he had term limited himself. He was elected twice to the United States Senate. We're going to talk to him today about falling in love with America again, his new book. Senator DeMint, thanks for agreeing to this
Terry,
interview.
it's great to be with you.
You have an interesting theory in the book of how people fall in love with their country. And it isn't about a flag, and it isn't about a neoclassical building in Washington, D.C. How is it that you think people fall in love with America?
Well, in the introduction, I talk about how I fell in love with America, and it's very consistent with what Edmund Burke said over 200 years ago, that the beginning of public affection are those little platoons in our lives, our families, the churches we belong to, the small business we work for, the bowling league, those people that are closest to us create our affection for each other and for our country as a whole. And I realized as I went through my life and really began and getting involved with the church, and then the church school, and people in the church got me involved with Rotary and the United Way, and before long I found myself involved with all these things in the community. And it made me very grateful in what Edmund Burke called public affection. It was true. It helps you fall in love with your fellow men and women because you're working with them, and you know that you disagree with them on a lot of things. They're different in a lot of ways, but because you're all free to kind of work together but still do your own thing, it makes you love your country.
You know, you put it actually in very concrete terms that I think a lot of people can identify. You said that when your children were younger, they were middle school, they were playing on the school basketball team, they were playing on the school soccer team, you and your wife were showing up at the games. Yeah. What happened there?
Well, I almost got thrown out of the games for yelling at the referee, for one thing.
Well, that's an American tradition,
I know. I didn't even think I had it in me, but once they get to call a foul.
Who's that guy? He's a future member of Congress.
My wife wouldn't even sit next to me. But what I found is the parents of the other kids on the team, we got close to them and really started loving all the other fellow team members of my sons and daughters just like they were our own children. We did trips together. It did make us close, and it made us feel closer to the school and to the church we were a part of, and very grateful for that. And I guess I didn't think about it as much then as I reflect back on it, but a lot of that changed as they left the smaller school and went to a large public high school. We really couldn't make much of a difference there. The kids couldn't be on the sport team because there were only a few slots and they were about winning. And but it's true throughout my life.
There's really a lesson right there, though, isn't there, that the little community that forms around the soccer team or the baseball team or the basketball team, the folks really get to know each other, they get involved in each other, they become a community.
They do.
But sometimes even on the community level, it expands out to a public school or a high school that doesn't actually, as you write in your book, catalyze that kind of bonding.
No, it doesn't. It's really little platoons. It's not that you don't like the whole. In fact, the whole point of this is you can love the whole, or have public affection once you sense that love around you in your life, and it just does not emanate from the top down. And the main point of falling in love with America again is America was unique in all the world because we were built from the ground up. And a lot of it was based on faith. I've heard a lot of people say, or not a lot, I heard Henry Kissinger once say there would be no America without the Reformation. He backed it up into the realization that God loves us individually and forgives us, and that we're important as people. That's fundamental to the American idea.
And that you have responsibilities to your family and to your neighbors and to your community.
Certainly. And as I said, as I got more engaged in these little platoons in my community and even in the state and eventually at the nation as a whole, I was very grateful, not so much for what my country did for me, but what it allowed me to do for myself. And that's a different kind of love than looking to some big brother to want that government to basically replace those little platoons in your life.
Now, in the book, you cite a Gallup poll that asks Americans what institutions they trust. And there's an interesting pattern there. Near the bottom, you had things like the presidency, the Supreme Court, the medical system, public schools, newspapers, big business, organized labor, in Congress.
Congress. I think Congress is the very bottom.
Yeah, they're the dead. And on the other side, you had the military, the police, organized religion.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's that hierarchy of trust in the United States of America?
Well, a lot of it does have to do with size. It has to do with whether or not these institutions actually serve the people they're supposed to serve effectively. And for the most part, the ones that are trusted are smaller. But even the military, it's the exception that proves the rule, because we know the military in little platoons and individual soldiers that have been in our neighborhood, and the military operates in basic little platoons and units. And a lot of the mistrusted institutions, the big corporations, in one way or another are allied with government, big government. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the main points here, is to dispel this myth that big government helps the little guy, helps the poor, helps little businesses. Nothing could be further from the truth. Big government supports big business, big unions, big banks, and big lobbyists.
You say in the book, this is a quote, a big, and this is a term, a big, it's a generic thing. A big is an organization that has reached such a size that its continued existence, its success, is no longer contingent upon the quality of service.
Right. It's, I mean, if you've got a big cell phone company or a big utility, they don't have to serve you. Mm-hmm. If you've ever tried to call and get an answer.
If it's a bank, same thing, right?
Yeah, if the bank is big. And I point out, I mean, the community banks were important. They helped little businesses like mine that started. A guy I knew in Rotary Club was president of a little bank, gave me a little loan to start a little business. And he supported my family for 15 years. But once that bank was bought by a large bank, the paperwork, the approval process became a lot more tedious.
You know, it's interesting. Later in the book, you talk about A.P. Giannini, who was from my hometown of San Francisco.
Yeah, was it? Yeah.
Who was the founder of the Bank of America,
right,
which, as you know, in the book was originally called the Bank of Italy.
Bank of Italy.
He was an all-American entrepreneur. But isn't he quite a different character from the sort of person who runs a massive public stock?
He was. I mean, his whole concept was serving those the other banks wouldn't serve, to be where they needed to be. And after a major earthquake, he kind of earned a broader trust by putting the money in, I guess, a truck or a wagon and taking it out and basically giving it to the people who he knew were his customers, knowing they would pay him back. And it was a different philosophy. And that's really what built our country. And I'm not saying bigs don't have a place, but we cannot have the America that we love if it's all big government, big banks, big corporations. That does not stimulate affection.
Well, this is jumping ahead in your theme a little bit, but you have A.P. Giannini, this guy who's an all-American entrepreneur. Starts a bank. His customers trust him. He trusts them. He loves the community he's a part of. He helped finance the Golden Gate Bridge, for example. Under the big government and the regulatory regime that was created after the banking crisis of 2008, 2009, the Dodd-Frank legislation, would a guy like A.P. Giannini be able to do what he did?
No, absolutely not. He wouldn't be allowed to open a bank or operate it on a handshake or anything like that. And what people need to know is this Dodd-Frank legislation was sold, just like many federal programs, as something that was going to protect the little guy from these big creditors and help small businesses. But the bill was largely written by the big banks that caused the collapse, and they are protected, bailed out, and while the legislation is making it almost impossible for community banks to survive.
You talk in the book about this sort of partnership, not just in terms of Dodd-Frank, but in terms of the regulatory and legislative schemes of the federal government in general, this partnership that exists between the mega corporation, the monster in any particular industry, and the federal government.
Yeah.
How does that work, and why does it work?
What the large companies have lobbyists and people who work directly with the regulators, and many of the regulators like to be friendly to the big companies because the idea is they go to work for the big companies someday to help them with future legislators. They make a lot more money as lobbyists or government relations people, whatever you call them, but they become very friendly. And these big companies like to write regulations that make it harder for the small smaller companies to compete with them. And so the large companies can deal with a regulatory maze much better than the small companies can. Like the big tobacco companies wanted the FDA to regulate cigarettes because they knew the smaller companies could not get approval to ever introduce a new brand.
So essentially there's this cooperation between big business and the government to create a regulatory barrier to entrepreneurs and small business people to compete with the big business.
In every category. It happens some at the state level too, of licensing different industries and to make it harder for people to get in once those people have established it. And I just want Americans to be aware of that and this idea that the big government's going to take care of you, it ain't working.
You know, there's, as you know, Senator, there's oftentimes, and the liberal media, I think, likes to perpetrate this myth that there's somehow a connection between big business and conservatism.
Yeah.
Yet here you are as the president of the most famous conservative foundation in America, and you're bashing big business.
Well, big business is no friend of conservatism. In fact, what we've found is, particularly in the last 10 years, that big corporations are likely, if they can get a carve-out with their lobbyists in a tax code, or big unions can get a carve-out from Obamacare, or the banks can get a then they support legislation that's bad for all the rest of us. And conservatives, you know, like I fought against the Import-Export Bank that gives large handouts to corporations, big corporations
like Boeing,
that don't need it. It was hard for me. Boeing's in my state back in South Carolina, but conservatives and big business are not necessarily supportive of each other. I mean, because part of what we do at Heritage is expose that. But big business likes big government for the most part. I'm not saying all of them, because I do hear some of them realizing that all these carve-outs in the tax code are actually hurting our overall economy. But for the most part, big business is in bed with big government.
A few months ago, when the Census Bureau put out its annual figures on median household income by county, there was a very interesting pattern there. It's a pattern that's existed for a long time, but in the latest standings by the Census Bureau of which counties in the United States had the highest average median household income,